Hello and welcome to what is actually the part 2 of this series of how to getting started with Blazor. In this video I will focus on how to perform CRUD operations with Blazor and also how you create a search bar to find some specific records from the database without you having to reload the page every time you search for something. If you already have a database connection, then it's cool. Else I set up a database connection in my first video that you can see in the card right now. But in this example we're going to use the weather forecast table that I created in the last video. So we do already have a database connection, which is why we can jump to the fun stuff and actually create the CRUD operations and the search bar. So let's go to Visual Studio 2022 and get started. If you have seen the first video, you might notice that the Solution Explorer is now on the left instead of the right. This was just so you could see it better. I also increased the font size just to make it hopefully easier for you to read. But the first thing we will do is to start our CRUD. So CRUD is short for create, read, update and delete. And we actually already created the read part because we can see the table in our project. If I just show you. So when I run the project, we can go to fetch data. And here we got the results from our database. You can see down here we have our own record and everything here is actually from the database. So this will be the read part. So what we're going to do now is make the creating part. So inside our fetch data file, I will go to the top of the file and just beneath the paragraph, I want to make a button where we say this should be a create button. And then we want to make a on click listener. So we say on click. And then we want to specify a method that we want to run. We have not created a method yet, but just let's call it create. So if we scroll down, we can go and create the create method. So we can make it like a private and it's a void because it don't return anything. And then it's a create method. And I actually just renamed it to show create because the purpose of the button is actually just to show a pop-up where we can actually create a new weather forecast. So I will make a new property now. And this is going to be a bool, which we will name is created shown. And this should be equal to false because we don't want to have the pop-up box shown when the page is loaded for the first time. But now let's go and say that when the button is clicked, this show create method will run. And then we want to set this is created shown to true. So now we can go and make the actual pop-up box in HTML. So I will just make some extra lines here. And then we want to say when the is created shown is true, then we want to show the content, which in this case is our create pop-up box where we have a form inside to create a new forecast. And of course we just need to write if, and then let's go and test it just with some text. The pop-up is now open. And let's try and run this. And going to our fetch data page and let's hit create, and now we can see the pop-up is now open. So now I'll just create some code for the pop-up box. I'll just copy and paste it and show it to you, and you can go and get it from my blog in the link in the description. So I'll just close this, and now I have created this pop-up box where we have a div where we have the background, which is just a black transparent background we're going to display. And inside that we have the actual pop-up box with just a white background where we're going to display the form. And then we have this edit form, which is a Blazor component that we can use, which help to make a form very easy. The only thing we have to do is to say what our model is, and we already have our weather forecast model that is called new weather forecast. And I actually created it down here, down in our code. So it's just like a property. We can access this object now. And then I say when this form is submitted, we're going to run the save changes method, which I also created down here. But it's just empty now. We are going to create it later on. But if we scroll up again, we can actually create the form now. So what we're going to say is that we have this validation tag at first, where it will check if the model is valid or not. And it's this model up here. And what this means is that if we go to the model, then inside here we could create a data annotation where we can say required and then include the data annotation. Then in this case the date would be required. So right here we have the input for our date, and if we submit the form without there is any input in this field, then it will come up with an error. But as you can see, I also say required here. So it will first check that one because that's HTML. So it's actually just to be double safe that there is a actual input. And if the user is going to submit the form without there is any input in this one, it will go to the server and then check the actual model and then say that there's something wrong. So it will just throw an error from the server instead of from the HTML, which is just in the browser. But all this is actually just our input field for the date. So I'll also create a input for the summary, for the temperature in Celsius and the temperature in Fahrenheit. And then we also have a submit button. And just to explain this model a little bit better, then we have this bind, which actually just take what's inside the input field and bind it with our model and then the property that we are going to specify. So it's actually just the same with all the other here. And as you can see, this is actually an input, but you can also use a text area if you want to have a longer text that the user should be able to write. And all these classes, these are actually bootstrap, so you don't really have to worry about them. That's just for styling. And I'm not going to go in depth with Bootstrap in this video, but I will show you that these two classes, I actually created some CSS for them. We have the background pop-up box and the pop-up create. And if we go to our site.cs file, which is under the www root folder and underneath the CSS folder, then we have our site.css, which is the CSS that will go out to every pages that we have. And you can also see here that they automatically include Bootstrap in our project. So that's why I'm just able to use it inside our form. But inside the CSS file, we have our background pop-up box class, where we're going to display a box that's just fixed on the page. It's going to be from the top left side. And it will have a width and height of 100%, so it fills all the screen. And the set index will be set to 100, so we are making sure that it will be in front of everything else. And then I set a background color, which is a RGBA color, which is red, green, blue, and alpha. And the 000 will make it black, and the alpha will make it just a little bit transparent. And the next class is the pop-up create class, which is the white box that we're going to display the form inside. You can see here we have a background that is white. It's also fixed, and it will be 50% from the top and the left. But if you just do that, it will start here in the middle and just form a box like this. And that's not what we want. So a little trick is that we can put it back again 50% of what the width and the height actually is. And then finally we set some padding on the box and some border radius just to make it look a little bit prettier. So if we now go and run this, I can see that I already run it. But if we rerun the project, we can go to fetch data and then say create. And now we have this nice pop-up box where we very soon will be able to actually insert a new row in our weather forecast. So let's go and close the project again. And let's go to our fetch data Razor file. And what we want to do now is actually to create this save changes. And I already made the method, so we just have to make the logic inside now. And the first thing we will make is the DB context, so that we can actually use link to add a new record into our database. So what we say is that we have our DB, and then we choose the weather forecast table, and we say that it should add the new weather forecast, which is this one we created up here. And the nice thing about this is that all the values are already set when we call this save changes, because all the properties inside the new weather forecast just binds to all the inputs that we created up here. So every time a new character is set into, for example, this temperature Fahrenheit, every time we change the temperature just by 1, it will bind and put the value into the property. But let's go down to the code again. And after we say that it should add this new weather forecast to our context, we will say that it should save the changes and it will be async. And that's also why I made the method async up here. And we say await this one. And after it saves the changes, we want to say that the pop-up box should be removed. So we set that to false. And then we actually want to empty the new weather forecast, because if we did not do that, then when we open the pop-up box again, then the old values will be in there. So we just have to create a new instance of our weather forecast. But now let's go and try to test this out. So I will run the project and let's say create. And let's just choose a date and just some random thing and say save. And this is actually a very important error that we get here, because our weather forecast model, if we take a look at this, we have no primary key. So we just have to add a primary key to this one. So we can say prop, and you just tap twice on the tab button, and this one should be a integer, so that's fine. And we will just call it ID, and then we will make a data annotation which should be key, and we will also make another data annotation called database generated option, and it's called identity. This comes with the schema pack inside the data annotations, and this will just help to auto increment the ID, so we don't have to manually write a new ID every time we add a new object to the database. So what we have to do now is to actually make a migration to the database so that this ID will be a column in our new table. But first, let's go to the Server Management Studio and delete the table that we already made. I'll just do it manually and say OK. So now when that's deleted, I will go back and I will add a migration, and it will be called add ID to weather forecast table. And it should be inside this package manager console. You have to close the project to actually get it down here, and then just hit enter on this add migration. Then it will create a migration file for us. And inside the migration file, we can see that it will add a new column called ID to our weather forecast, which is exactly what we wanted to do. So now again, in the package manager console, we can say update database and hit enter. And now if we go into the database again, we can go and update this and remove this one. And then we want to see the design of the table, and you can actually see it created a ID. But if we also go and say take a look at top 1000 rows, we can now see that it actually created IDs for the already existing rows that is in the database. So now we should be able to test this, because now all the rows have a unique key. So let's go to Visual Studio and run the project and go to fetch data. And now we can see the table. So if we hit create and try to make a new test and just some random temperatures and say save, we do actually get the same error. But let's try and go to our master context file, because down here we have said that the model builder has no key. So what we will do is just to insert our own key. So it should look like this, has key, and then make the lambda expression to say that it should be our ID from the weather forecast. And of course, normally you don't have to fix thing in here, but it's because we have scaffolded it. So let's try and stop the application again and run it again. And go to fetch data page, say create, and now we try for the third time. And let's hit save. And this time it actually created the record in the database. If we go back here, we can see that there now is a new line called test. But as you might notice, it did not do anything. It had to close this box. And the reason that it did not close the box is because if we close this window, we need to add the state has changed method. And what this will do is that it will just update the UI to match if you have any, just like these, where you have to show a pop-up box where it's going to say false and true, because we have to remember that this is run on the server. So just by saying that it's false, it will not update the UI at the user or at the client in the browser. But by saying state has changed, it will automatically find out if there is any UI changes that needs to be done. So if we run this now and create a new one again, and let's say test2, and save it, you can see that the box now disappear, but it will not update the row inside the table. And that's just because we haven't told it to do it. So let's go and make a method for that. So I just created this update table method, which is async. And what it's doing is that it's fetching everything to the table. It's exactly what it's doing here when we initialize the site. So we can actually take this update table and just replace it with this. And we will also do it down here. So when the page is loaded the first time, it will fetch everything it has to display in the table. And the same it will do when we save a new record. So let's go and test this out. And now it's actually not getting anything, and that's because we need to say that this should be await, because we are doing this async. And when we await something, we cannot await void. So we need to say that this should not be void, but a task instead. And then also remember to await this one. And actually we have to put it above the state has changed method, because else it will not update the UI. So let's go and run this again, and let's create a third test. So I'll pick a date, say test3, and some random temperature, and say save. And now you can see it actually came right here. But the next thing I will do is to go in and change this table so it will order it all by ID, because right now this came at the second bottom. I actually don't know why. But if we're going to order it so the newest will be on top, then I think it would look great and it would make more sense. So let's close the project again. And the way we'll do it is that we will say weather forecast and then say order by descending. Then make this lambda expression where we're going to say that it should be ordered by the ID. So now we can save it and actually run the project already again. And now that we go to the fetch data page, you can see that the test3 is now the first record in this table. And then it will be descending down by the ID. But to speed things up a little bit, because we still need the U and the D in CRUD. So we need the update part and we need the delete part. But now I have created the update part, and I will show you how this works. We have been go very much in details with the creating part, so I think you are ready now to just see how the code works for how to update a row. And the way I have done it is, you can see here I have added another column called edit and then a button to every row. And when you click this, you get the actual data from the row that you have been clicking the edit button from. And if I go in here and say that this should be test 100 and it should be 500 Celsius instead, we say save. And now you can see we have 500 Celsius and test 100. And the cool thing about this is that it's actually the same box that we're just reusing for the edit. I also added this cancel button so we can close it again. And if we go to create, you can see it's just the same box that we're going to reuse. So let's go to the code and see how this works. And first of all, in the table that we are going to see all the data from, I have inserted this edit column. And then down here, I have added a button to every row inside our table. And the way it works is that we have this button, and then we have a on-click listener on the button. And then we have this syntax to create a way to send our parameter to this edit method. So what I did was to create this edit method that takes a variable that will be the ID from the row. So if we scroll down to the edit method, it's right here. Then I actually just set the new weather forecast, which is the object that is going to be displayed inside our pop-up box. I just set that to the ID that I found in the weather forecast. So I say weather forecast and then find async. And when you use this find, it automatically knows that you are just going to find the ID. And then, because this is when the button is clicked, the edit button, then we want to show the pop-up box again, and state has been changed should also be run to update the UI. So now when the pop-up box has changed, I have also made a small change to the pop-up box. I have added this new hidden input field, which will bind to the ID of our new weather forecast. So the form knows which ID that we are going to edit. And as you might remember, when we submit this form, we are going to run this save changes. So I also made some changes to this method. So let's try to scroll down. And actually the only changes I made is this if statement. Because if the new weather forecast ID is equal to 0, then we know that this is a new record that is going to be inserted to the database. Because by default, this hidden input field with the new weather forecast ID will be set to 0. And if the ID is not 0, then we will trigger this else statement where we just want to edit the entry inside our database. So we say entry and then give it our new weather forecast object. And then when you say state and then say it should be equal to entity state and it should be modified, then it automatically go in and check all the values for the new weather forecast, which is actually just the one that we want to edit. And then it will see if there's any changes. And when we come down here, it will save the changes. So no matter if it's a new record we are putting in or if it is one we actually just want to edit, then we just do the same thing afterwards. So that's basically how the edit is going to work. But I will also show you how the cancel button works. And I just put it outside the edit form just to be sure that it don't trigger anything because it is a button. But when you click this button, which is named cancel, then you trigger this close pop-up method, which very basically just set the is created shown to false and then reset our new weather forecast. And then finally just note that the state has changed. The UI is going to be updated the right way. But now that we have the C, R and U in CRUD, we just need the D, which is delete. And this should be very straightforward. We can just go and take and copy this edit method and let's call it delete instead. And we actually want to use this one, weather forecast find by ID. That's fine, but we don't want to interfere with that. So we can just create a new variable and just call it weather forecast, just like this. And then what we want to do is say db, and then we want to target the weather forecast again. And then we want to say remove, and then we want to remove the row that we just found. But now that we have removed the row from the database, we actually want to update the table, and we don't want to show the pop-up box. That would make no sense. So let's update the table instead. And then let's go and actually add the remove button in the table. So we scroll up and we can actually just copy and paste the edit button. And let's say that this should be remove. Oh, sorry, we called it delete actually. And it will still be the same ID that we want to delete, so that's fine. And we want to call this delete. And we also want to create a new headline in the table here, which is called delete. So let's try this out. And as we can see, just because we actually copy pasted the edit button, we also have a gray delete button. We might want to have a red one instead. But let's try to delete this test 5. And it did not work because we didn't actually trigger our database command. So what I mean by that is if we go outside again If we go in here, we can say that it should be save changes async. So now let's test this out again. So now we have the test 5 and I say delete, and it's still not removing from this table, but when we go into the database, we can actually see that it is removed. And if we go back to the code again, we can see that we just need to await this update table. And I'll just refresh the project, and we can see that the test 5 is removed, but that's also because we have reloaded the page now. So let's try and delete this test 100. I hit delete, and now you can see that it's going to disappear from the table. Of course, you can always expand the functionality, so like, adding a box where it says that the row has been deleted, and also when you create, you can add a box where it says that the row was added successfully to the database or something like that. But that was actually all the CRUD operations. So congratulations if you have come this far. And when you know the CRUD operations in Blazor, you really have a powerful tool to create some dynamic pages. But the last thing in this video I will show you is how you make a search bar so that we can search in the summaries on these weather forecasts. And with all the knowledge that you have now, then the search bar should not be that big of a problem. It's actually not that complicated to create. So first of all, let's go back to the code. And let's create an input field that is going to be our search bar. So now I have scrolled to the top. And what we want to do is to make an input field here. And what we want the input field to do is to, when we say on input, we want to run this search method. So what that means is that every time there is an input into the input field, we will call this search method. So every time you tap your keyboard, it will go and search. And then we have a placeholder where it's going to say search. So it's just so it tells us this is a search bar. And then we add some padding with Bootstrap just to make it look a bit prettier. So now the only thing we have to do is to create this search method. So let's scroll to the bottom. I have already made it right here. And every time the method is run, it will go and use this args, where we can find the value of this, and that would be the search term that is inserted into the input box. And I actually think we can delete all this. So it's just like this. And the out comment, we have to delete that. And else we're just going to use the database here and say that we have to find some forecasts, and we're going to find them where the summary contains the search term. And then we just order them by descending with the ID, and then we make it to a list so we can save it inside this forecasts. And at last we just want to change the UI, and that should actually be it. So if we try to run this project, we can now see that we have this search field, and if we try to write test, you can see that it's updated on the fly. So if I write 3, you can see it's only this one, and if we just type back, everyone will come back. And if we search for EE, you can see only freezing will appear. So it's a pretty nice way to search a database. And of course this is locally, so everything is just happening instant. If it was in a real world scenario where you host the database and the website on the internet, you might want to add a loading icon or something, because it might take maybe half a second to get the results from the database. But I think this is a good time to stop this video. You have learned all the CRUD operations and also how to make a search bar to search in the results. So hopefully now you are more comfortable using Blazor, because it's a very, very powerful tool. As you can see, it's when you set up everything correctly, it's all just happen on the fly, and you don't even have to use any JavaScript to do this. I actually think it's very, very cool that you can make everything just with C#. But of course we can thank WebAssembly for that, and the W3C to make WebAssembly a standard in the browser now. But I hope you learned something, and please like the video and subscribe to my channel. It will help a lot to make these videos come more often. But else, just have a nice day. Bye.